Hi, I'm Elizabeth Greene, and I'm going to be talking today about Roman leather shoes. Roman shoes and leather are found in anaerobic and waterlogged contexts in Northwest Europe, and they are more common than one might think at first. In Britain, the largest Roman assemblage is found at Vindolanda near Hadrian's Wall, but shoes and leather are also found at several other wet sites around the country, including London and Carlisle. Shoes are some of the most robust items made of leather, and often the thick pieces of cowhide that made up the shoe soles survive quite well. The uppers of Roman shoes were usually made from a thinner, more delicate hide such as goat or calfskin, and they are therefore preserved less often. Shoes and leather are most commonly found on British sites in wells, sealed pits, defensive military ditches, in sealed domestic layers, or during riverside reclamation. We know of several different names for shoe types from surviving Latin and Greek texts, such as the solea, the socius, the calceus, the carpetina, and so on. But it can be sometimes difficult to define exactly which name belongs to which shoe, because there are endless variants in actual footwear examples. You will find differing definitions of shoe types, but here I will explain just the general understanding of each type. But before I do that, I should just explain the terminology of parts of a shoe, as this can determine the type of shoe being identified. The soles can be multi-layered, so that there is the insole, midsole layers, and the outside layer, called the tread sole, that's on the back. And the sole unit consists of 4 parts: the toe, the tread, the waist, and the seat. The uppers are the part of the shoe above the sole unit that wrap around the top of the foot, as you can see here. It is often the style of the uppers that determine how we categorize a shoe into each type. So you see here we have sort of a low boot. If we look at a shoe like this, it's somewhat different, and I'll talk about those types. The most commonly found shoes in Britain are the Carpetina, which is a slipper-like shoe made of a single sewn piece of cowhide without hobnails, and then it would be laced over the top of the foot through various types of lace holes, as you can see with this one here. Sometimes they were decorative. These are often called a house shoe because there was little padding to be able to walk on the shoe outside. Carpetinae were worn by all people, but they are particularly popular with children, as you can see this tiny example right here, very, very small. The solea, or sandal, has a solid unit with an attachment for the thong worn between the toes and over the instep of the foot, rather like the modern-day flip-flop. They were worn by women and girls in the early empire, and then also by men in the 3rd century. And you can see this sole here of a sandal. Military boots had sturdy, undecorated upper leather that rose from sometimes well above the ankle. There were small lace holes to secure the upper seam on the instep, and were usually heavily nailed on the treadsole. In the 1st century, the caliga was the military boot of choice, which had an opened work leather upper. But by the end of the 1st century, this had been replaced by the closed military boot seen here. The calceus is a general term for a shoe that is closed, usually around ankle height, and has hobnails on the treadsole. And you can see this lovely pair right here, probably worn by a child. They had laces that went along the upper edges of the shoe to close it at the top. The fashion for all of these shoe types changed rapidly. The more common construction type seen in Britain is the nailed shoe, which relies upon the hobnails to connect the sole unit and the upper around the outer edge of the shoe. There can be as many as 5 or 6 layers of thick cowhide to form the sole unit, as you can see with this shoe with the layers separated. So you can actually see how that all comes apart, but they were originally the part of the same shoe. These are sometimes attached by a leather thong, like a thick thread, to hold them together, and then nailed around the outer edge of the shoe sole. Less commonly, a sole unit can be completely sewn with various kinds of stitching holding together the sole layers, including any midsole layers and padding leather called laminae, as you can see here. You can just see the thong, the leather thong, sticking out and holding these layers of shoe together. And then this was also nailed. The uppers of the shoe are secured in one of 2 ways. Either just the edge of the upper is secured around the outer edge of the whole shoe and between the sole layers. So that's what you have here. You can see the line of hobnails, where the holes for the hobnails, where it would have been secured into the shoe. It is then held tight with the outer line of nails. Alternatively, the upper is part of a large piece of leather that is a complete sole layer that sits between the tread sole and the insole. The upper is then shaped to fit around the foot and is sewn at the necessary seams. So this is actually a splayed Carpetina, but you can understand how if you had a foot sole in here, the upper will have just spread around and been secured in that way. Depending on the shoe type, there will often be a seam at the front of the toes called the vamp, where the upper leather has wrapped around the back of the heel and both sides of the foot and needs securing at the front over the toes. On Carpetinae, often the only piece sewn is the back of the heel. You can see that right here. On both nailed shoes and Carpetinae, the last piece to make the shoe secure and function properly is the lace. On some shoes, such as this one here, the lace is part of the single piece of the upper and protrudes right here, just above the vamp to be strung through the lace holes. Other shoes have a separate lace, more like shoes today. You can see one that's still associated but separate from this shoe. Some of the nicer shoes found in Roman contexts in Britain and Northwest Europe have stamps and cutout patterns to decorate the soles and the uppers of the shoe. Stamps are found predominantly on the insole of a shoe and are small decorative elements such as rosettes, concentric circles, urns, wheat sheaves, eagles, and winged patterns. These can appear in a clear decorative pattern, or sometimes they appear quite randomly on the surface. And you can see here a number of wheat sheaves having been impressed upon the surface of the insole. Here you can see concentric circles and a few urns. The uppers may be embellished by color dyes and the addition of decorative metals, but these rarely survive in Britain, though they certainly existed. Quite common is a bit of embellishment by way of incised patterns and rouletting on the surface of the upper leather. You can see a bit of that on this shoe here. Probably need a close-up for that. Lace holes often have half circles of incised lines radiating outward, or a line of incised decoration along the upper edge. The edges of the leather can be scalloped or cut with some other decorative pattern. A common decorative element is what we call a fishnet pattern, in which essentially the entire surface of the upper shoe is cut out with small holes like a net. And you can see that one right here. This technique could be further embellished by wearing colorful socks to make the cutout pattern stand out even further. This shoe style appears to have been worn by more elite individuals, such as the prefect and his family when they're found in a military context. More rare but well known is the added element of a maker's mark on the sole of the shoe. One shoe from Vindolanda, known as the Lepidina slipper, has the mark of Lucius Aebutius Thales stamped 3 times on the sole, almost giving it the quality of a high-end designer shoe from a well-known maker. Many shoes, but not all, have a nailed tread sole, with anywhere from a few to dozens of hobnails creating a sturdy surface on which to walk. The patterning of hobnails can be quite utilitarian, as you can see in this example here, with lines of studs covering almost the entire walking surface of the bottom sole, right straight through. Hobnails are also shaped into quite decorative patterns, both simple and quite complex. Sandals tend to have rather delicate patterns and decorative shapes, such as you see here with a trident shape up at the toe and the tread. And they often have fewer studs than in, for instance, a military boot. So here's another example. Hobnail patterns found in Britain and Northwest Europe include lozenges, tendrils, tridents, and other curvilinear shapes that accentuate the curves of the foot. So you can see quite clearly from this discussion and examples shown that shoes could be very particular, with as many shapes and sizes as there were people to wear them. At the same time, there were certainly types that were mass-produced, and the same styles can be found in very different regions of the empire. It is also clear that fashions changed over time, sometimes quite quickly. For instance, the round-toed shoes of the 1st century, which you can see here, give way in the later 2nd century and into the 3rd century to a very pointed toe. So you can really see the difference here. The pointed ones are almost like a winkle picker of the 1950s, which curved upward at the tip of the toe sometimes. You've almost got that here. Women's sandals had a particularly fine shape with the toes cut out and the sole taking on the shape of the foot, the actual foot. And we've got a good example of that here where you can really see the toes coming out. This design must be accounted for really by the aesthetic preference of the wearer rather than any ergonomic necessity. And sandals shift and change from the 1st to the 3rd centuries to take on a much wider and purely impractical shape by the 3rd and 4th centuries. And we've got some examples of the changing shape of sandals here. And then another one there. Shoes show us more than just what people wore on their feet. We can also learn about people's podiatric issues or how shoes reflect something about the physiognomy of the person who wore them. You can see in these shoes 2 very different feet indeed. A very long and narrow foot and a very short and wide foot. This one may suggest even a deformity or a very, very different shoe or foot shape indeed. Some shoes also show us that Roman shoemakers understood how to correct for problems in a person's gait. 3 shoes from the Vindolanda assemblage were fitted with a long iron bar around the inner or outer edges of the heel, presumably in order to correct if a person leaned too much to one side while walking. And you can see the example just here. Sometimes you see this bar right here on the side, sometimes here, and this one goes all the way around. This effect is also achieved by adding several more studs in one part of the tread sole, a technique which is seen fairly often. At Vindolanda, there are 3 shoes that have a flat bronze disc adhering to the insole of the shoe. We've got an example here. This is an unusual place for any sort of metal. The discs could simply have been decoration, but it is also tempting to see them used for some medicinal purpose, with the connection to the healing properties of copper alloy, since that would have come into contact with the actual foot. And lastly, shoes can be used to stand proxy for those who once wore them. Shoe assemblages help us to better understand who lived where in Roman Britain. The most telling case study of demography, as demonstrated by shoe finds, is at the military fort at Vindolanda, where shoes of women and children are found in all fort spaces and throughout areas of the site that were once unexpected places to find such items, such as barracks. Adult male shoes predominate, but in certain spaces, upwards of 40 to 50% of shoe finds belong to women, and children well under the age of 18. Infant-sized shoes attest to the presence of women recently giving birth, and every size in between can be found from a baby's booty to a male size 46 or UK size 12.5.